The dining room was full. 30 people packed around one long table, talking over each other, passing dishes, laughing loud. It was Thanksgiving, and everything smelled like turkey and warm bread and the kind of comfort that's supposed to make you feel safe. Noah had been excited all day. He ran ahead of me into the dining room, scanning the table for a spot to sit. And then he found one. Right next to my mom. He pulled out the chair, climbed up, and looked back at me with that big open smile of his. That's when my mother's voice cut through every single conversation in the room. She looked directly at my son, and without flinching, she said to him, "Kids who don't try, don't sit at this table." The room went dead quiet. Noah froze. His little hands were still on the edge of the chair. He turned to look at me, and I saw it in his eyes before he could hide it. That look. That specific look that no parent ever wants to see on their child's face. Right then, something inside me snapped. At that moment, I had no idea this dinner would be the last time I ever called that house home. Hi everyone, my name is Emily Carter. I'm 38 years old. I'm an ER nurse based in Chicago, and what I'm about to tell you happened on Thanksgiving night, 2023. I've thought about sharing this story for a long time, and I kept putting it off because honestly, part of me wasn't ready to say it out loud. But I think it needs to be said, so here we go. That morning, I was driving Noah to my mom's house. Just the two of us. Like always. Noah was 8 years old at the time, sitting in the back seat, watching the bare trees go by outside the window. He's always been a quiet kid, sensitive, the kind of kid who notices when you're tired before you say a word. He's not a straight-A student. He doesn't play 3 sports or win spelling bees. What he loves is music. He'll sit at a little keyboard for hours, just picking out melodies by ear, completely in his own world. And to me, that's everything. But to my family, it never felt like enough. I already knew walking into that dinner was going to be hard. It always was. My family has a certain idea of what success looks like, and Noah and I never quite fit that picture. I was a single mom working long shifts in an emergency room, and my son was a dreamy, musical kid who struggled in school. Not exactly the highlight reel they were looking for. About 20 minutes from my mom's house, Noah's voice came from the back seat. He was picking at the hem of his jacket, not looking at me, and then quietly he asked me, "Do you think Grandma likes me?" My hands tightened on the steering wheel. A cold feeling moved through my chest. I glanced at him in the rearview mirror, and I forced a smile and said back to him, "Of course she does. She loves you." He nodded slowly, like he was trying to believe it. Like he'd asked that question before, and wasn't sure he trusted the answer anymore. I told him everything was going to be fine. I really believed that. Or maybe I just needed to. Because I had no idea what was waiting for us behind that door. The moment we walked through that front door, I felt it. That familiar tightening in my chest. The house was already packed. Coats piled on the bench by the entrance, kids running through the hallway, the smell of roasted turkey, and my mom's famous apple pie drifting from the kitchen. On the surface, it looked like every warm Thanksgiving you'd see in a movie. But I knew better. I'd grown up in this house. I knew exactly what lived underneath all that warmth. Noah stayed close to me as we made our way through the crowd. His hand found mine without me offering it. That told me everything about how he was feeling. My sister Rachel spotted us from across the living room. She was standing near the fireplace, holding a glass of sparkling water, looking exactly the way she always looked at these things. Put together, polished, like she'd stepped out of a catalog for people who had it all figured out. Right after she waved us over, she pulled me into a quick hug and said to me with that bright smile of hers, "You made it." I was starting to wonder. It wasn't mean. It never was with Rachel. It was just that specific kind of comment that reminded you, without saying it directly, that you were a little late, a little off, a little behind. Her husband stood nearby, nodding at me with that polite corporate smile he always had. And then there were her boys. Tyler and Mason, 12 and 10 years old. Both of them already dressed like they were going to a school presentation, hair combed, sitting at the coffee table doing something on a tablet. Rachel didn't waste any time. Within 2 minutes of us arriving, she turned to me with that familiar proud mom look and said, "Tyler just got accepted into the advanced math program at his school. And Mason's reading at a ninth grade level." She said it casually, like she was just mentioning the weather. But there was nothing casual about it. I nodded and told her that was great. And I meant it, I really did. Those boys worked hard. But I also felt Noah shift slightly beside me. He'd heard it. Kids always hear everything. I glanced down at him. He was looking at Tyler and Mason with this quiet, careful expression. Not jealous exactly, more like he was trying to figure out where he fit in a room that had already decided he didn't. I squeezed his hand. He didn't squeeze back. Tyler looked up from the tablet and spotted Noah. Without any of the adult awkwardness, he just said, "Hey, you want to see this game?" And just like that, Noah's whole face changed. He looked up at me for permission, and I nodded. And he walked over and sat down next to his cousin. For a few minutes, watching them together, I let myself breathe. Maybe it would be okay. Maybe I was building it up too much in my head. That's what I kept telling myself as I made my way toward the kitchen to find my mom. But before I even got there, I passed by the hallway where a row of framed photos lined the wall. It was something my mom had always kept up. Family milestones, graduations, awards, holidays. I slowed down without meaning to. There was Rachel at her college graduation, her wedding photo, Tyler's first soccer trophy, Mason at some academic ceremony, holding a ribbon. I kept scanning, and then I found the one photo of Noah. It was from 2 Thanksgivings ago. He was sitting at the edge of the group shot, slightly out of frame, looking off to the side, like he hadn't realized the picture was being taken. That was the only one photo. Slightly out of frame. Right then, a slow, quiet ache settled into my chest. I stood there in that hallway for just a moment longer than I should have, and somewhere in the back of my mind, a voice I'd been ignoring for years finally started getting louder. I should have walked out right then. But I didn't. I stayed. I found my mom in the kitchen, the way I always did at these things. Linda Carter has run every holiday gathering from that kitchen for as long as I can remember. She's 65 years old, and she still moves through that space like she's conducting an orchestra, stirring, tasting, directing whoever happened to wander in. When she saw me, she smiled and held out her cheek for a kiss. I gave it to her. "You look tired," she said, already turning back to the stove. "Not it's good to see you. Not I'm glad you came. Just that. You look tired." I told her it had been a long week at the hospital. She made a small sound, something between acknowledgement and dismissal, and then she asked me to check on the rolls in the oven. So I did. We moved around each other in that kitchen for a few minutes without saying much. And then, the way she always did it, she eased into it. Casual, conversational, like she was just making small talk. Still facing the stove, she asked me, "How's Noah doing in school these days?" I kept my eyes on the oven. I told her he was doing okay, working on some things. She was quiet for a second, and then she said, "Rachel mentioned Tyler's already doing algebra. He's only 12. I straightened up and looked at her. I said that was great for Tyler. She nodded slowly, in that way she had, where the nod itself said more than the words. Then she wiped her hands on a dish towel and said to me, still not looking at me directly, "I just worry about him, Emily. I really do. 8 years old and still struggling with basic reading. Don't you think it's time to look into something more structured?" I told her we were already working with his teacher. She made that sound again. I set the rolls on the counter a little harder than I meant to. A few minutes later, I slipped out through the back door to get some air. Noah had wandered into the backyard with a couple of the younger cousins. They were kicking a ball around near the old oak tree, and for a moment he looked genuinely happy out there. Loose and easy in a way he hadn't been all day. My mom came outside not long after me. She stood next to me on the back step, watching the kids. And then she spotted Noah doing something. He'd stopped playing and was crouching near the fence, tapping out a little rhythm on a wooden post with two sticks, completely lost in whatever was going on in his head. She watched him for a moment. Then, in a voice that was almost gentle, "Almost," she said to me, "He's always off in his own world, isn't he?" I didn't answer. She kept going. "Music is a nice hobby, Emily, but it's not a plan. Tyler and Mason have plans. Rachel made sure of that early." I felt something hot and sharp move through me. I kept my voice level and told her that Noah was 8 years old. She tilted her head slightly and said, "That's exactly my point." Then she went back inside, like she hadn't just said what she said. I stood there on that back step, staring out at my son. He was still tapping his rhythm on the fence post, completely unaware. And for a second, I felt this unbearable mix of love and grief wash over me. Love for him, exactly as he was, and grief that the people who were supposed to love him the same way just couldn't see it. I called him in from the yard a few minutes later. He ran over with pink cheeks and bright eyes. Still humming something under his breath, he looked up at me and said, "Can I sit next to you at dinner?" I told him absolutely. I put my arm around his shoulders and walked him back inside. That was before dinner started. That was before everything exploded. Dinner was called at 6 o'clock. 30 people shuffled from the living room and the kitchen and the backyard all at once, funneling toward the long dining table that my mom set up every year. It stretched from one end of the dining room almost to the other, covered in her best tablecloth, the white one with the embroidered edges she only brought out for holidays. The good plates, the tall candles, the little place cards she hand-wrote every year in her neat cursive. I was behind Noah as we made our way in. He was moving fast, the way kids do when they're excited about something, weaving between the adults with his elbows tucked in. I watched him scan the table, reading the place cards, looking for his name. And then he stopped. He'd found a spot, right next to my mom at the head of the table. He reached out, pulled the chair back with both hands, and started to climb up. His face was open and happy. He was humming that same little melody he'd been humming all afternoon. Right at that moment, before he could settle into the seat, my mother's voice came out sharp and clear from the other end of the table. The way she said it wasn't a shout. It was worse than a shout. It was calm, controlled, the way you'd correct a dog that had gotten on the furniture. She looked directly at Noah and said to the whole table, "Kids who don't try, don't sit at this table." Everything stopped. 30 people and not one sound. Noah's hands were still on the edge of the chair, his humming cut off mid-note. He stood there completely still, half up and half down, like his body hadn't caught up to what his ears had just heard. I watched him turn his head slowly toward my mother. Then he turned to look at me. And there it was, that look. His eyes were wide and confused at first, the way a kid looks when something happens that doesn't make sense yet. And then the confusion shifted. I watched it happen in real time. Watched the understanding move across his face, and with it, something else. Something quiet and devastating that no 8-year-old should ever have to feel in a room full of family. He understood. He understood that she meant him. That he was the kid who didn't try. That he didn't belong in that chair. My body went cold. I felt it start in my hands and move up through my arms and into my chest, this wave of something I couldn't name right away. Not anger. Not yet. Something before anger. Something closer to shock. I opened my mouth. Nothing came out. Around the table, I could feel people looking anywhere but at Noah. Some people suddenly needed to refold their napkins. Someone reached for the water pitcher. Rachel was very still at her end of the table, eyes down. Her boys, Tyler and Mason, were both watching Noah with wide, uncomfortable eyes. Nobody said a word. Nobody pushed back. Nobody said, "Linda, come on." Nobody said anything at all. And in that silence, my mother picked up her own napkin, smoothed it across her lap, and looked down the table like she was ready to begin. Like it was already over. Like what she'd said was simply a fact that had been stated, and now everyone could move on. Noah still hadn't moved. His hands had slipped off the back of the chair and were hanging at his sides now. He was looking at the floor. That's the image I'll never get out of my head. My son, standing at that table, in the middle of 30 people, looking at the floor. I finally moved. I walked toward him, and the sound of my own footsteps felt too loud in that room. I crouched down slightly, so I was closer to his level, and said quietly to him, "Come here, buddy." He didn't cry. That was the thing that broke me most. He didn't cry. He just turned away from the chair, from my mother, from the table, and he pressed his face into my shoulder. His arms came up around my neck, and he held on. And I held him back, right there in the middle of that dining room, with 30 people watching and nobody saying a single word. I could feel his breathing against my neck. Small, controlled breaths. He was trying so hard not to fall apart. 8 years old, and he was already trying to hold it together in a room that had just told him he wasn't good enough to sit down. I straightened up slowly, my hand on the back of his head, and I looked at my mother. She met my eyes for just a second, and in that second, I saw it. No apology, no regret, just the steady, unmovable certainty that she had said something reasonable, something true, something that needed to be said. A cold, hard clarity settled over me. All those years of nodding and biting my tongue, and telling Noah it would be fine and convincing myself that the comments weren't that bad, and that family was family, and you pushed through. All of it collapsed in that 1 second, and that's when I stood up straight. And that's when I opened my mouth. In my 38 years on this earth, I had never raised my voice at my mother. Not once. I'd bitten my tongue through 100 dinners like this one. I'd swallowed things that deserved to be said. I'd driven home from this house more times than I can count with my jaw tight and my eyes burning and Noah asleep in the back seat, and I'd told myself that keeping the peace was worth it, that family was worth it, that she didn't mean it the way it sounded. Standing in that dining room with my son's face buried in my shoulder, I was done telling myself that. My voice came out steady, steadier than I expected. I looked directly at my mother and said to her, "Apologize to him." The room didn't move. My mother looked up at me with that expression she had, that particular stillness that meant she was deciding whether what I'd said was worth responding to. Then she set down her fork very deliberately and said back to me, "Emily, sit down. Dinner is getting cold." Something ignited in my chest. I took one step toward the table and said to her, louder this time, "I'm not sitting down. I want you to look at your grandson and apologize to him, right now." I heard a chair shift somewhere down the table. Someone whispered something I couldn't make out. My mother straightened in her seat, and when she spoke again, her voice had that edge in it, the one that had been shutting me down since I was a teenager. She looked at me and said, "I'm not going to apologize for telling the truth. That boy needs to learn that effort matters. That's not cruelty, Emily. That's how you raise children with standards." The word "that boy" hit me somewhere physical. I felt my hands curl at my sides. I told her through my teeth that he was 8 years old, that he was her grandson, that he'd done nothing wrong except want to sit next to her at dinner. She lifted her chin and said back to me, "And what has he done to earn it? What is he working toward? You let him float around with that little keyboard all day instead of pushing him. That's not my fault. That's yours." And there it was. The thing underneath the thing. The comment wasn't really about Noah's chair. It never was. It was about me, my choices, my parenting, my life. Before I could respond, Rachel's voice came from the other end of the table. She spoke carefully, the way she always did, like she was trying to manage a situation before it got worse. She looked at me and said, "Emily, I think what she's trying to say is that she just wants the best for him. Maybe this isn't the right time to." I turned to look at my sister and said, Don't do that right now." Rachel pressed her lips together and looked down at her plate. A few of the other relatives had gone very still in that particular way people do when they don't want to get involved, but also can't look away. My uncle at the far end of the table was studying the centerpiece like it was the most interesting thing he'd ever seen. My mom's friend Patricia had her hands folded in her lap and her eyes on the window. Nobody was touching their food. My mother looked around the table, and something shifted in her posture. She had an audience and she knew it. She looked back at me and said, with a kind of practiced composure that made my skin crawl, "I have raised 3 children. I know what it takes to build character. Coddling a child who refuses to apply himself is not love, Emily. It is a disservice. One day you'll understand that." The word coddling landed like a slap. Noah had gone very quiet against me. I could feel him listening to every word. I could feel him trying to make himself smaller. And that, more than anything else she'd said that night, was what pushed me past the point of no return. I leaned forward slightly and said to my mother, in a voice I didn't recognize as my own, "You just humiliated a child in front of his entire family because he wanted to sit next to you, and you're calling it character building. Do you hear yourself?" For 1 second, something moved across her face. Something that might have been the beginning of doubt, but it closed up just as fast as it opened. She straightened again and said to me quietly, firmly, "Sit down, Emily." Rachel said my name softly from her end of the table. One of my aunts murmured something to her husband. The candles on the table flickered from some draft I couldn't locate. Noah's grip on my arm tightened just slightly, just enough for me to feel it. And in that moment, time seemed to slow all the way down. I looked at my mother sitting at the head of her perfect table with her perfect place cards and her good china and 30 people who were all looking somewhere else because it was easier than speaking up. And I understood something with absolute clarity. She was never going to apologize. Not tonight. Maybe not ever. But what happened next, none of us expected. Because that's when one of the kids at the table pushed back his chair and stood up. It was Tyler, Rachel's 12-year-old, the one with the algebra and the advanced reading level and the perfectly combed hair. He pushed his chair back from the table slowly, like he'd been thinking about doing it for a while and had finally made up his mind. The sound of the chair legs scraping against the floor was the only sound in the room. Rachel looked at her son with an expression caught somewhere between confusion and alarm. She said to him quickly, "Tyler, sit down, honey." Tyler didn't sit down. He was standing straight, both hands at his sides, staring at the center of the table like he was looking at something none of the rest of us could see. His jaw was set in a way that looked too old for his face. Then he looked up at my mother and said, in a voice that was steady but thin around the edges, "That wasn't fair. What you said to Noah wasn't fair." The room went a different kind of quiet than before. Before, the silence had been the silence of people pretending not to notice. This was the silence of people genuinely not knowing what to do. My mother looked at Tyler with a measured expression and said to him, "Tyler, this is an adult conversation. Please sit down and finish your dinner." But Tyler didn't move. He swallowed once, hard, and then he said, "You say the same stuff to us, about trying harder and earning things and having standards. All the time. Every single time we come here." Rachel's voice came out sharp and low from the other end of the table. She said to her son, "That is enough. Sit down right now." Tyler turned and looked at his mom. And what I saw on his face in that moment stopped my breath. It wasn't defiance. It was exhaustion. 12 years old, and he looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with bedtime. He looked at Rachel and said, "I got a 92 on my math test last month and you told me I should have gotten 100. A 92, Mom." Rachel's face went pale. Her husband put his hand on her arm. Tyler wasn't done. His voice started to shake at the edges now, the way a voice does when someone has been holding something in for a very long time and the container finally cracks. He said to the table, to no one and everyone at once, "I study every single night. I don't even like math. I've never liked math. But I do it because every time I come here, I feel like if I don't have something to show, then I don't matter." The silence after that was total. Somewhere down the table, somebody let out a slow, careful breath. I looked at my mother. For the first time all evening, she was not composed. She was very still in a way that looked less like control and more like she'd been struck and hadn't moved yet. And then, before anyone could say anything, Mason pushed his chair back too. He was 10 years old, 2 years younger than his brother, rounder in the face and usually the quieter one of the two. He stood up next to Tyler, and the sight of the two of them standing there side by side did something to the air in that room that I still can't fully describe. Mason looked at my mother, and in a very small voice, said to her, "I cried in the car last Thanksgiving, the whole way home. Because you said my history project was just okay." Rachel made a sound that wasn't quite a word. Her husband dropped his head. Right then, Mason's chin started to wobble. He pressed his lips together, trying to hold it, and then the tears came anyway, fast and quiet, rolling down his face while he stood there at the dinner table in his nice shirt, with his hair still combed. He said, barely above a whisper, "I just want to feel like I'm enough when I come here. That's all I want." After those words left his mouth, everything in that room shifted at once. Two of my aunts had tears on their faces. My uncle had both hands flat on the table and was staring at them. Patricia had stopped looking at the window and was pressing a napkin to her mouth. Rachel had her hand over her eyes. The long, decorated table with the embroidered cloth and the good china and the handwritten place cards suddenly looked like a completely different thing than it had looked 20 minutes ago. I felt Noah shift against me. I looked down at him. He was watching Tyler and Mason with wide, careful eyes. Not scared. Something more complicated than scared. I think he was trying to understand that he wasn't the only one, that this house had been pressing down on all of them, just in different ways. My mother had not spoken since Mason sat back down and buried his face in his hands. She was sitting at the head of her table, and for the first time in my life, she looked uncertain, not apologetic, not soft. Just uncertain, like someone who had been absolutely sure of the ground they were standing on and had just felt it move beneath them. Rachel finally lowered her hand from her face and looked at her boys for a long moment. Then she looked at me. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. In her eyes, I saw something I hadn't seen from my sister in years. Something honest and unpolished and real. The perfect family image she'd been holding up since the moment we walked in had just come apart at the dinner table, dismantled by her own children, and she knew it. The candles on the table were still burning. The turkey was still on the platter. Everything was still technically in place. But in that silence that followed Mason's words, something fundamental had changed in that room. I could feel it. Everyone could. I looked down at Noah one more time. He looked back up at me, and in that moment, I made my decision. I'd spent my whole life trying to belong in that house, trying to be enough, trying to raise a son who felt loved by people who kept moving the finish line every time he got close. And standing there in that dining room, with Noah pressed against my side and the sound of Mason's crying still hanging in the air, I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Calm. Not the numb kind of calm that comes from shutting down. The other kind. The kind that comes when you've finally stopped fighting something inside yourself and everything goes still. I reached down and picked up Noah's coat from the back of a nearby chair. He watched me do it without saying a word. Kids know. They always know. I helped him into it, one sleeve at a time, and he let me, standing straight and cooperative with those big, careful eyes of his. Around us, the room was still suspended in that heavy, unresolved silence. A few people had started murmuring to each other in low voices. Rachel was leaning toward Mason, one hand on his back. Tyler had sat back down, but was staring at the table. My mother hadn't moved from her chair at the head of the table. She was watching me. I picked up my own bag from the floor near my seat. I took Noah's hand in mine, and then I looked at my mother one last time. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I spoke clearly, at a volume that everyone at that table could hear, and I said to her, "I have spent years making excuses for the way this family treats my son. I'm done doing that. He is a good kid. He is kind and he is creative and he tries every single day in ways that have nothing to do with test scores. And he deserved better than what you did to him tonight." My mother's eyes stayed on mine. Her hands were folded in front of her on the table. She said to me quietly, with that same unmovable certainty, "Emily, if you walk out that door, You're making a very big mistake." Right then, something locked into place inside me. I looked at her and said, "No, I'm correcting one." I heard Rachel say my name from somewhere down the table. I heard one of my aunts make a small sound. I didn't turn around. I looked down at Noah. He was looking up at me with those wide, serious eyes. I gave his hand one squeeze and said to him quietly, "Let's go, buddy." He nodded, no hesitation. We walked through the dining room together, past the long table with the good china and the embroidered cloth, past the candles that were still burning, past 30 people who were either watching us or trying very hard not to. I heard a chair push back somewhere behind me, and for a second I thought someone was going to stop us. Nobody did. We reached the front hallway. I grabbed our things from the bench by the door. Noah stood next to me, close, patient. I opened the front door, and the cold November air hit us both at once. Sharp and clean and real, in a way that nothing inside that house had felt all evening. Noah stepped out first. I followed him, and I pulled the door shut behind me. I didn't slam it. That was important to me, even in that moment. I didn't slam it because I wasn't doing this out of rage. I was doing it out of something quieter and more permanent than rage. We walked down the front path toward my car. The neighborhood was still and dark around us, porch lights on up and down the block, the sound of other people's Thanksgivings faint and distant. Noah's hand was still in mine. I didn't look back at the house, not once, because I already knew that if I looked back, the part of me that had spent a lifetime trying to make that place feel like home might waver, and I couldn't afford to waver. Not tonight. Not with my son's hand in mine, and the cold air on my face, and every step forward feeling more right than the last. I walked toward the car. I didn't look back. He didn't cry in the car. That was the first thing I noticed. I'd buckled him in, started the engine, pulled away from the curb, and Noah just sat there in the back seat looking out the window at the passing streetlights. Quiet. Completely quiet. And somehow that was harder to sit with than tears would have been. I knew what crying looked like. I knew how to handle crying. I didn't know what to do with that particular silence. The kind that tells you a child is processing something too big for his age. I kept my eyes on the road and let him have it for a few minutes. The city slid past us. Other houses with their lights on, other families inside doing what families do on Thanksgiving. I turned the heat up because the night had gotten colder, and I noticed Noah had his chin tucked into the collar of his coat. About 10 minutes from my mom's house, his voice came from the back seat. Small and careful. He said to me, "Are you mad?" I exhaled slowly. I told him no. I told him I wasn't mad at all. He was quiet again for a moment, then he said, "Are you sad?" I thought about that honestly before I answered. Then I said to him, "A little bit, but not the bad kind of sad." "You know what I mean?" He thought about it. Then he said, "Like when something's over but it needed to be over?" I gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. 8 years old, I told him yes. Exactly like that. He nodded to himself and went back to looking out the window. A few blocks later, he said, "Tyler stood up." I told him I saw that. He said, "He didn't have to do that." I told him no, he didn't. He was quiet again. And then, so softly, I almost missed it over the sound of the heater, he said, "I didn't say anything. At the table, I didn't say anything back to her." Right then, something pulled tight across my chest. I signaled, pulled over to the side of the road, and put the car in park. I turned around in my seat to look at him. He was watching me with those careful eyes of his, trying to read my face. I said to him as clearly as I could, "You didn't need to say anything. That was not your job. None of what happened tonight was your job." His brow pulled together a little. He said, "But she said I don't try." I held his gaze and said, "I know what she said, and I need you to hear me right now. She was wrong. You try every single day. I see it. I see you." Something shifted in his face. The careful, controlled expression he'd been holding since we left the table started to come apart just slightly at the edges. His eyes went glassy. He pressed his lips together hard, fighting it. I reached back and put my hand on his knee and said, "You don't have to hold it in, not with me." And that was all it took. The tears came fast and quiet, the way his tears always came. Like he'd been trained somewhere along the way to cry as small as possible so nobody would notice. He wasn't sobbing. He was just finally letting it out. I unbuckled my seatbelt and reached back as best I could, and he leaned forward into my hand, and I held the back of his head and let him cry for as long as he needed to. Cars passed us on the street. The heater hummed. Outside, somebody's front yard had a string of orange lights still up from Halloween, blinking slowly in the dark. We stayed like that for a while. When he finally pulled back and wiped his face with his sleeve, he looked at me and said, "Can we get pancakes?" I laughed. It came out of me before I could stop it, this real, relieved laugh. And Noah smiled too, a small watery smile that was the best thing I'd seen all night. I told him absolutely. We could get pancakes. I turned back around, put the car in drive, and pulled back onto the road. The night felt different now, still cold, still dark, but different. Lighter in some way that had nothing to do with the streetlights. I watched him in the rearview mirror as we drove. He was already looking out the window again, but the tension was gone from his shoulders. He looked like a kid again, instead of whatever that place had been turning him into. But even as I drove and watched him and felt that small relief settle in, something in the back of my mind stayed quiet and alert. Because I'd worked in an emergency room long enough to know the difference between a wound that's finished bleeding and a wound that's just gone deep. And the real damage, the kind that shows up slowly, in the weeks and months after a night like this one, that part hadn't shown itself yet. The weeks after Thanksgiving were quiet, in a way that felt fragile. My mom called twice. I let both calls go to voicemail. Rachel texted me a long message that I read 3 times and didn't respond to for 4 days. My aunts, my uncle, a few cousins, they all reached out in their own way. Some apologetic, some just checking in, some clearly hoping I'd say everything was fine so we could all move on and pretend it hadn't happened. I didn't say everything was fine, because it wasn't. Noah went back to school the following Monday, and his teacher called me by Wednesday. She said he'd been withdrawn. Not disruptive, just quiet, in a way that was new for him. He'd stopped raising his hand. He'd stopped volunteering answers even when she knew he knew them. Like he'd decided somewhere in the back of his 8-year-old mind that putting yourself out there just gave people something to reject. I got him into therapy about a month later. His therapist, a calm, patient woman named Dr. Okafor, told me after the 3rd session that Noah had a lot of feelings about not being the right kind of smart. Those were his words. The right kind of smart. I drove home from that appointment and sat in my parking garage for 15 minutes before I could go inside. Over the following year, my mother sent gifts on Noah's birthday and at Christmas. A book of math puzzles, a science kit, things chosen with intention, her intention, the message wrapped inside the wrapping paper as clear as anything she'd ever said out loud. Noah opened them politely and set them aside and never touched them. Rachel made more of an effort than I expected. She started texting me separately from the family group chat. Not about the kids' achievements, just regular things. A funny story from work. A show she was watching. Small, careful steps towards something that might eventually resemble honesty between us. Tyler and Mason, to their credit, asked Rachel if they could visit Noah a few times over that first year. She said yes. Those visits were easy in a way that the family dinners never had been. 3 boys playing video games in my living room, nobody keeping score of anything. Noah was always looser after those visits. More like himself. It was the adults who were the problem. It had always been the adults. By the 2nd year, Noah was doing better. Dr. Hafter and H.E. Okafor had given him language for his feelings, and that language had given him somewhere to put things instead of just carrying them. He'd started playing keyboard again with real enthusiasm, writing little songs, recording them on my phone and playing them back with his head tilted to one side, listening critically the way musicians do. He was becoming someone. You could see it happening in real time if you paid attention, but certain things stayed. He still tensed up whenever we drove through certain parts of the city that reminded him of the route to my mom's house. He still got quiet before family gatherings, even small ones, even ones that had nothing to do with my mother. The body remembers what the mind tries to move past. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in early October, almost exactly 2 years after that Thanksgiving night, I heard a knock at my front door. I opened it. My mother was standing on my porch. She looked smaller than I remembered. Older. She was holding her purse in both hands in front of her, the way people hold things when they don't know what to do with their hands. She looked at me and said, "I was wondering if we could talk." I stood in the doorway for a moment without saying anything. Then I stepped aside and let her in. She sat down on the couch in my living room and looked around at the space like she was trying to orient herself, like she'd expected something different and wasn't sure what. I made coffee. It gave me something to do with my hands. When I brought it out and sat across from her, she wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at me and said, "I've been thinking about that night for 2 years. And I know I was wrong. What I said to Noah was wrong. I need you to know that I know that." Right then, my chest tightened in a way I hadn't anticipated, because part of me had waited a long time to hear those words, and another part of me understood that hearing them didn't automatically fix what they were supposed to fix. I told her I appreciated her saying it. I told her it mattered, but I also told her it wasn't really my forgiveness she needed to earn. She looked at me quietly. Then she said, "Do you think he'd talk to me?" I told her I didn't know. I told her I'd ask him. I went down the hallway and knocked on Noah's door. He was at his keyboard, headphones on, working on something. He pulled one side off and looked up at me. I told him Grandma was here. I told him she wanted to talk to him. I told him he didn't have to if he didn't want to. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked back at his keyboard. And very quietly he said to me, "I'm not ready." I nodded. I told him that was okay. And I realized right then that this wasn't my decision to make anymore. It never really was. 2 years have passed since that Thanksgiving night, and my life looks different now, in ways I didn't see coming. Noah is 10 years old. He's still not the kid who wins math competitions or fills up a trophy shelf. But he walks into rooms differently than he used to, easier, like he's allowed to be there. Dr. Okafor says he's made real progress. I see it every day in the small things. The way he plays his keyboard without apologizing for it. The way he laughs without checking first to see if it's okay. The way he sleeps without that tight, coiled stillness he used to carry, even in his sleep. My relationship with my mother is complicated in a way that I've stopped trying to make simple. She calls. I answer most of the time. We talk about surface things, careful things, the weather and work, and how the garden is doing. The deep stuff sits between us like furniture we've both agreed not to move. Rachel and I are closer than we've been in years. Not perfect, but real. And real is something I've learned to value a lot more than perfect. Tyler and Mason still come over sometimes. Noah considers them friends now, not just cousins. That means something. As for my mother and Noah, that door is still closed. Maybe one day he'll open it. Maybe he won't. And I've made my peace with the fact that it's his door to open, not mine. I protected my son. I'd do it again, without hesitating. But I've also had to sit with the harder question, the one that kept me up at 3 in the morning for a long time after that night. How do you protect your child from someone who genuinely believes they're helping? I still don't have a clean answer for that. I'm not sure one exists. What I do know is this. Every kid deserves to pull out a chair and sit down without having to earn the right to be in the room. Every single one. So I want to ask you something before you go. Would you force your child to forgive someone who hurt them? Or would you let them decide? Tell me what you would do. I'd really like to know.